"This is my house now," my daughter-in-law said, standing in my hallway with a contractor behind her. "And you should be grateful we're letting you stay until Sunday." I had just come back from visiting my husband's grave, still wearing the gray wool coat Henry bought me for our last anniversary, with a few dry leaves caught on the hem and the cold Pennsylvania air clinging to my sleeves. For a moment, I thought I had walked into the wrong house. The front door was open. A pair of muddy work boots sat on my rug. A measuring tape stretched across the entryway floor like a warning line I was no longer supposed to cross. On the wall beside the staircase, the wedding portrait of Henry and me was gone. In its place was a pale rectangle of dust and sunlight, the exact shape of 46 years being quietly removed. Madison stood beneath it with her arms folded, her blonde hair pinned perfectly, her cream sweater untouched by the mess around her. Behind her, a man in a canvas jacket held a clipboard and avoided looking at me. My son Brian stood near the living room window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the dogwood tree Henry planted the spring we paid off the mortgage. He did not say hello. He did not ask how the cemetery was. He did not ask why my hands were trembling around my purse strap. I looked from the missing photograph to the contractor, then back to Madison. "What is going on?" I asked, though my voice sounded smaller than I intended. Madison gave me the kind of smile people use when they have already decided you are too old to understand what they are doing to you. "We're making plans, Eleanor. Practical plans. This house is too large for you, and Brian and I have waited long enough to start our real life." Our real life. The words landed softly, almost politely, but they took the air right out of the hallway. This was the same house where I had rocked Brian through ear infections, packed his school lunches, sewn his Halloween costumes at midnight, and stood beside Henry during every hard year, every tight bill, every winter when the heating system coughed like it might give up before we did. I turned to my son. "Brian." He finally looked at me, but only for a second. "Mom, Madison is just trying to make this easier." Easier. That was what people called cruelty when they did not want to admit they were participating in it. The contractor cleared his throat and said he could come back another time, but Madison lifted one hand without looking at him. "No, we're fine." Then she pointed toward the living room as if giving instructions in a house she had already claimed. "We're opening up that wall, replacing the old cabinets, and converting the den into a nursery when the time comes. The upstairs bedroom will be ours, of course. It gets the best morning light." My bedroom. The room where Henry had kissed my forehead every night before turning off the lamp. The room where his reading glasses still sat on the nightstand because I had not yet found the courage to move them. I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not numb. Not weak. Quiet, like snow falling over a road just before the first car leaves tracks. "And where do you expect me to go?" I asked. Madison's smile widened slightly, as if she had been waiting for that question. "Willow Creek has senior apartments. They're nice. Small but nice. Brian already picked up the brochure." She glanced toward him, and he reached for a folder on the coffee table but did not bring it to me. That hurt more than if he had shouted. My own son had come prepared. Madison stepped closer, lowering her voice in a way that made it colder, not kinder. "You had your time here, Eleanor. Henry is gone. Things change." I looked past her into my living room, at the empty space above the mantel where Henry's flag from his service years used to be displayed, now wrapped in bubble wrap on the sofa like an unwanted decoration. My grief had been heavy enough that morning. Now it had company. Betrayal stood in my hallway wearing lipstick and a wedding ring. I reached into my purse, took out my house key and held it in my palm. Madison's eyes dropped to it. For the first time since I walked in, she looked pleased. She thought I was surrendering. She thought silence meant defeat because that was how people like her measured older women, by how much they could swallow without making a scene. I placed the key gently on the small oak table Henry built in our garage 30 years ago. "I'll need one night," I said. Brian's shoulders loosened with relief. Madison gave a satisfied little nod. "That's reasonable." I picked up Henry's framed photograph from the bottom of the staircase, where someone had set it face down, and brushed a smear of dust from the glass. My husband's smile looked back at me, calm and steady, the way it always had when I was afraid. I carried the picture toward the stairs without another word. Behind me, Madison resumed talking to the contractor about paint colors, cabinet finishes, and how much brighter the house would feel once the old things were gone. She did not understand that I was not going upstairs to pack. I was going upstairs to find the number of Henry's attorney, the one he had written in blue ink on the back of an envelope and told me to keep somewhere safe. That night, I let them believe I was leaving. That was their first mistake. I found the envelope in the bottom drawer of Henry's nightstand, tucked beneath his old wristwatch, a stack of Veterans Day cards, and the faded photograph of us standing in front of this house the year we bought it. I was 31 in that picture, wearing a yellow blouse I had made myself because money was tight and every extra dollar went toward the mortgage. Henry had one arm around my waist and the other hand resting proudly on the porch railing, as if he had just been handed the keys to a castle instead of a 3-bedroom house with peeling paint, a stubborn furnace, and a backyard full of crabgrass. But to us it had been a castle. It had been ours. Lancaster County was still quiet back then, with cornfields at the edge of the neighborhood, and a little hardware store 2 miles down the road where Henry knew every clerk by name. He worked early shifts at the postal distribution center, and I took bookkeeping jobs from home while raising Brian, stretching casseroles over 3 nights and clipping coupons until my fingers were black with newspaper ink. Every board in that house had a memory attached to it. Henry replaced the kitchen cabinets after Brian spilled grape juice into the old drawers. He built the oak table in the entryway during a winter storm when the roads were closed and we had nothing to do but drink coffee and listen to the wind. He planted the dogwood tree after my first knee surgery because I could not walk far. And he wanted me to have something beautiful to look at from the living room window. This house was not an investment to me. It was not square footage. It was the shape of my life. After Henry passed, the rooms became too still, but they were still mine. I kept his boots by the garage door for 3 weeks because moving them felt like admitting he would never come in from fixing something. I still made coffee in the same dented percolator he preferred, even though Brian had once bought us an expensive machine we barely understood. I ate breakfast at the small kitchen table facing Henry's empty chair and listened to the refrigerator hum, the old pipe settle, and the faint traffic from Maple Grove Road. Grief did not arrive all at once. It came in ordinary moments. A second plate I did not need. A television remote left untouched. A grocery list with his handwriting on it. Madison started coming by during that time with covered dishes, soft voices, and a sympathy card she had clearly picked up at the drugstore on the way over. First, I was grateful. She folded laundry without being asked. She took out the trash. She told me I should not worry about bills or maintenance or all the things Henry used to handle. She called me Mom in front of Brian, and I tried to believe there was kindness in it. But little things changed. She opened cabinets without asking. She moved my good china from the dining room hutch to a plastic bin in the basement because, as she said, nobody uses that old-fashioned stuff anymore. She took down Henry's fishing calendar from the kitchen wall and replaced it with a plain whiteboard where she wrote appointments I had not agreed to attend. When I asked about it, Brian kissed my cheek and said, "Madison is just helping you get organized." I wanted to believe my son. That is one of the most dangerous things a mother can do when her heart is tired. She can mistake control for concern because the alternative hurts too much. 2 weeks after the funeral, I found my bedroom curtains tied back differently, my medicine cabinet rearranged, and Henry's favorite recliner pushed into the corner to make room for a catalog Madison had left open on the coffee table. Modern farmhouse living room ideas. She had circled a white sofa, a glass table, and a note in blue pen that said, "Much brighter once the old pieces are gone." I remember standing there with the catalog in my hands, hearing her voice from the kitchen as she spoke to Brian in a low tone. "She needs time," Madison said, "but not too much. If we let her settle again, she will never leave." Brian answered so quietly I could not make out his words, but I heard the sigh that followed. A tired sigh. A surrendering sigh. I set the catalog back exactly where I found it and walked upstairs as if I had heard nothing. That was the first night I locked my bedroom door. Not because I was afraid of strangers. Because strangers were not the ones measuring my life for removal. By the next morning, I understood that Madison had not entered my home all at once. She had slipped into it one drawer, one shelf, one decision at a time. She began with things small enough to make me feel foolish for noticing. The lavender hand towels in the downstairs bathroom disappeared and were replaced with white ones she said looked cleaner. The framed school picture of Brian at age 8, missing both front teeth and smiling like the world had never disappointed him, was moved from the hallway table to a box marked Family Extras. Henry's old coffee mug, the blue one with a chip near the handle, was gone from the cabinet and tucked behind paint samples in the pantry. When I asked Madison about it, she tilted her head and smiled as if speaking to a neighbor's confused grandmother. "Eleanor, I am just trying to freshen things up. You have been living in the past for too long." I looked at Brian, waiting for him to say that his father's mug was not clutter, that a wedding picture was not outdated, that a woman should not have to defend her memories inside her own walls. He only rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Mom, it does feel a little heavy in here." Heavy. That was what they called Henry now. Not beloved. Not missed. Heavy. After that, the changes came faster. Madison ordered new curtains without asking me, and had them delivered to my porch in boxes taller than my grandchildren. She changed the living room rug, saying the old one made the room look sad. She stacked my books in the garage because, according to her, nobody wanted shelves full of dusty hardcovers anymore. She even called a junk removal company to give an estimate on the basement, before I caught her standing near Henry's tool bench with a man holding a tablet. "Those tools are not junk," I said from the stairs. Madison turned slowly, not embarrassed, only annoyed that I had appeared before she finished. "Eleanor, Brian has his own tools. Nobody needs all of this." I walked past her and rested my hand on the wooden bench Henry had built himself. There were still pencil marks along the edge where he had measured boards for Brian's first treehouse. "Your husband does not need them," I said quietly. "But I do." The man with the tablet looked down at his shoes. Madison pressed her lips together, then gave a short laugh. "This is exactly what I mean. You are too attached to things." I did not answer. I had spent 46 years learning that not every insult deserved my voice. Some deserved a witness. So I began keeping records. Dates. Times. Photographs. Receipts I had never approved. I wrote everything in the small red notebook Henry once used for grocery lists. On Tuesday, Madison moved my china. On Wednesday, Madison called a painter. On Thursday, Madison told the mail carrier that future packages could be left in care of Brian and Madison Whitaker. That last one stayed with me. I heard it from the kitchen window while rinsing a cereal bowl. The mail carrier, a kind woman named Denise who had been on our route for years, sounded uncertain. "Does Mrs. Whitaker know about that?" Madison gave a soft little laugh. "She is having trouble keeping track of things lately. We are helping." The bowl slipped from my wet fingers into the sink, landing with a crack that ran clean through the porcelain. I stood there staring at it, one half resting against the drain, the other tilted toward the light. That was how they wanted people to see me now. Not grieving. Not tired. Not a woman whose husband had just been buried. Unreliable. Fading. Easy to move aside. Later that afternoon, I walked to the end of the driveway to bring in the mail, and saw a paper taped to the inside of the mailbox door. It was not official. Just a neat white label Madison must have printed from her home computer. Brian and Madison Whitaker. No Eleanor. No Henry. No trace of the people who had paid for that mailbox, painted its post every spring, and pulled it upright after every hard winter. I peeled the label off slowly and folded it once, then twice, before placing it in the pocket of my cardigan. A car passed on Maple Grove Road. Somewhere down the block a dog barked. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, but something in me had shifted. For weeks I had been asking myself whether Madison meant to erase me. Standing there in the cold beside a mailbox that no longer carried my name, I finally had my answer. That Sunday evening, Madison invited me to dinner in my own dining room, as if I were a guest who needed permission to sit at the table Henry and I had bought with our first tax refund. She arrived at 5 o'clock with Brian, carrying a grocery store rotisserie chicken, a salad in a plastic container, and a folder tucked under her arm. She wore pearl earrings and the pleasant expression she saved for moments when she wanted other people to mistake pressure for kindness. "We thought it would be nice to have a family conversation," she said, setting the food on my counter without asking where anything belonged. Brian kissed my cheek, but his lips barely touched my skin. He smelled like aftershave and worry. I had already made pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans because Sunday dinner had been Sunday dinner in that house for more than 40 years. But Madison looked at the covered dishes on the stove and smiled with pity. Oh, Eleanor, you did not have to go through all that trouble. We are trying to simplify things for you. I looked at the folder under her arm. Is that what we are doing tonight? Her smile tightened. We are helping you make a healthy transition. We sat down at 6, the way Henry always liked, though his chair at the head of the table stayed empty. Madison tried to sit there once, then paused when she saw me watching. She chose the seat beside Brian instead. For 15 minutes, she talked about Willow Creek Senior Apartments as if she were describing a resort. They had walking paths, a community room, weekly card games, and a shuttle to the grocery store twice a week. You would not even have to drive much, she said. At your age, that is a blessing. I cut my green beans into small pieces and listened. Brian stared at his plate. Finally, Madison opened the folder and slid a glossy brochure across the table. A smiling silver-haired couple stood on the front, holding coffee mugs on a fake balcony. We toured it yesterday, she said. There is a one-bedroom unit available next month. Actually, there is a wait list, but I explained your situation, and they were very understanding. My situation? I had a home, a paid mortgage, a valid driver's license, a doctor who said my blood pressure was improving, and enough sense to know when a trap had been polished until it looked like concern. What exactly did you tell them? I asked. Madison glanced at Brian. Only that you have been struggling since Henry passed. Brian shifted in his chair. Mom, nobody is saying you cannot manage anything. It is just a lot. The house, the yard, the bills. The bills are paid, I said. The yard man comes every other Saturday. And I have lived here since before you knew how to tie your shoes. His face colored, but he still did not look at me for long. Madison placed a second paper on the table, this one less glossy. This is just a preliminary consent form. It allows Brian to help coordinate the move and handle certain property matters, so you do not get overwhelmed. The words were soft. The paper was not. I saw phrases like authorization, transfer preparation, household disposition, and future sale review. My hand rested beside my water glass, steady enough to surprise me. You want me to sign this tonight? Madison leaned back as if I had disappointed her by reading. It would be best. The longer we wait, the harder this becomes. Then she said it again, not loud, not angry, just certain. This is our house now in every way that matters. Brian just does not want to hurt your feelings by saying it. The room went still. Even the old wall clock seemed to hesitate before ticking again. I looked at my son, the boy I had once carried through a snowstorm because he had a fever and Henry was working a double shift. Brian, I said, is that what you believe? His jaw moved before his voice came out. I think Dad would want us to be practical. That was when something closed inside me, gently but completely. They had not only taken my husband's chair and my name from the mailbox. They were trying to borrow Henry's voice to push me out the door. Madison uncapped a pen and placed it near my plate. Just sign here, Eleanor. Then we can all stop pretending. Picked up the pen. Brian exhaled. Madison's eyes brightened. I studied the page for 3 quiet seconds, then set the pen down without making a mark. I need my reading glasses, I said. They are upstairs. Madison looked annoyed, but pleased enough to let me go. Of course. Take your time. I stood slowly, folded my napkin, and walked out of the dining room with the same careful steps I had used when carrying sleeping babies up those stairs. Halfway up I heard Madison whisper, "See? She knows." No, I thought, reaching the bedroom and closing the door behind me. I know now. I did not look for my reading glasses because they were already hanging from the silver chain around my neck. I stood in the bedroom Henry and I had shared, listening to the faint murmur of Madison's voice below me, and opened the nightstand drawer with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The envelope was still there, cream-colored, slightly bent at one corner, with my name written across the front in Henry's familiar blue ink. Ellie. Not Eleanor. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Ellie, the name he used when the world had been unkind, and he wanted to remind me I was more than whatever had happened that day. I sat on the edge of the bed, beneath the lamp he used to turn off every night, and slid one finger under the sealed flap. Inside was a business card for Charles Bennett, our attorney for more than 20 years, and a short note in Henry's handwriting. If anyone ever makes you feel like a guest in the home we built, call Charles before you sign a single thing. I read it once. Then again. The words did not feel like paper. They felt like a hand on my shoulder. Downstairs, a chair scraped against the dining room floor. Madison was probably getting impatient. Brian was probably telling her to give me a minute, using that tired voice of his, the one that made him sound like a man caught between duty and convenience. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the number on the card. Charles answered on the third ring. His voice lower than I remembered but still careful, still kind. "Eleanor," he said after I told him my name. "I have been waiting for this call longer than I hoped I would." I closed my eyes. Those words told me everything and nothing at once. I explained as calmly as I could. The papers on the dining room table. The senior apartment brochure. Madison saying the house was hers. Brian not stopping her. Charles did not interrupt. When I finished, I heard him breathe out slowly. "Do not sign anything," he said. "Do not agree verbally. Do not leave the property overnight unless you choose to. And Eleanor, listen closely. The house is yours." I looked toward the window, where the last light of evening rested on the dogwood branches. "Henry and I owned it together," I said. "No," Charles replied gently. 3 years ago, Henry transferred his full interest to you through a properly recorded deed. He told me he wanted it simple. No confusion. No pressure after he was gone. The house belongs to you alone." For a moment the room blurred, not from fear this time, but from the sudden weight of being protected by a man who was no longer there to stand beside me. Henry had known. Maybe not every detail, not the exact words Madison would use or the way Brian would lower his eyes, but he had sensed the hunger gathering around our life. Charles continued, "There is more." Henry updated several estate provisions. If any heir or family member attempts to pressure you into transferring the house, questions your capacity without medical cause, or tries to remove you for financial gain, their inheritance can be delayed or challenged. He was very specific. I let my free hand rest on Henry's pillow. It still held the faint shape of him, or maybe I only needed to believe it did. Why did he not tell me? I whispered. Charles was quiet for a moment, because he hoped he was wrong, and because he did not want your final years together poisoned by suspicion. That was Henry, always carrying the heavy thing so I could enjoy one more ordinary morning, one more cup of coffee, one more Sunday dinner before the truth came to sit at our table. I asked Charles what to do next. His voice changed then, becoming precise. He told me to photograph every document Madison had brought, record the date, keep the mailbox label, preserve any messages, and invite no one to handle my finances. He would prepare certified copies of the deed and come by if needed. Before we hung up, he said, "Eleanor, you are not being difficult. You are defending your home." I repeated that sentence silently after the call ended. Not difficult. Defending. I walked to the mirror above the dresser and looked at myself. 70 years old. Silver hair pinned loosely. Tired eyes. A black dress from church still under my cardigan. Madison had mistaken all of that for weakness. So had Brian. I took a deep breath, placed Henry's note back in the envelope, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my sweater. Then I went to the top of the stairs and listened. Madison was saying, "If she stalls tonight, we push harder tomorrow." I waited until she finished. Then I walked downstairs, not as a woman searching for her reading glasses, but as the owner of the house. I returned to the dining room with the envelope in my sweater pocket, and my reading glasses still resting against my chest. Madison noticed them first. Her eyes dropped to the little silver chain, then narrowed for half a second before her face smoothed back into that polished smile. "There they are," she said lightly. "We were beginning to worry." Brian looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to decide whether something had changed while I was upstairs. It had. I sat down, placed both hands beside my plate, and looked at the unsigned paper in front of me. "I will not be signing anything tonight." Madison blinked once. "Eleanor, we talked about this." "No," I said. "You talked." Brian avoided my eyes. I listened. The room fell into a silence so clean I could hear the furnace click on in the basement. Madison leaned back, her smile thinning. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." I folded the brochure slowly and pushed it back across the table. "Then let it be hard." Brian whispered my name, but there was no strength in it. Just discomfort. Madison gathered the papers with quick, angry movements, careful not to tear them because people like her respect documents more than people. She stood and said they would give me until morning to think clearly. I did not tell her I had never thought more clearly in my life. After they left, I locked the front door with the old brass key Henry had carried for decades. I stood there for a long time with my palm against the wood, feeling the house breathe around me. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I made coffee in Henry's dented percolator, put on my navy coat, and drove 8 miles to a locksmith on Harrisburg Pike that had been there since Brian was in high school. The man behind the counter, Mr. Alvarez, remembered Henry. He used to come in for spare screws and talk my ear off about old door hinges, he said with a smile. I smiled back, but only a little. I need every exterior lock replaced today, I told him. Front door, back door, garage entry, basement door, mailbox if you can do it. I also need the garage keypad reset. He did not ask personal questions. Good tradesmen often know when a house problem is not really about the house. By 10:30, his van was in my driveway. By noon, the old locks were lined up on my kitchen counter like small brass witnesses to everything I had tolerated. He installed new deadbolts, changed the storm door latch, reset the garage code, and helped me connect a doorbell camera Brian had given Henry 2 Christmases ago, but never bothered to install. I paid by check from my own account. Then I called the utility company and confirmed that all notices would come directly to my email and mailing address. I called the bank and added a verbal password to my accounts. I called my doctor's office and requested a printed copy of my most recent wellness visit summary, the one that said I was independent, alert, and capable of managing my own affairs. Each call was ordinary. Each call stitched me back into my own life. At 3:15, Madison arrived in her white SUV with 2 women I had never seen before and a stack of fabric samples in her arms. I watched from the kitchen as she walked up the porch steps with the confidence of someone entering a place she had already taken in her mind. She put her key in the lock. It did not turn. She tried again. Then she looked at the door as if the wood itself had betrayed her. My phone buzzed. "Something is wrong with your lock," she said before I could speak. Her voice was sharp, but controlled because the women behind her were listening. I opened the doorbell camera app and looked at her face on the small screen. Perfect makeup. Tight jaw. Eyes full of disbelief. "Nothing is wrong with it," I said. "It works exactly the way I asked it to." Her mouth opened slightly. "You changed the locks?" I looked at the signed receipt on the counter, then at Henry's photograph beside the coffee pot. "I secured my home." Madison stepped closer to the camera, lowering her voice. "Eleanor, do not embarrass yourself. Let us in." I watched the 2 women exchange a glance behind her. For the first time, Madison was not controlling the room. She was standing outside it. "No," I said calmly. "You may call before visiting, and I will decide whether the visit works for me." Her face flushed. "Brian has a right to come into his father's house. Brian may call me too." She stared into the camera, and I saw the moment she understood that the woman she had planned to move by Sunday had learned how to close a door. Not slam it. Not shout through it. Simply close it and keep the key. By 4 o'clock, Madison had stopped speaking to me through the doorbell camera and started speaking about me to everyone else. My phone began buzzing while I was still wiping the locksmith's fingerprints from the new brass deadbolt. First came Brian. Then my sister-in-law Carol. Then Henry's cousin from York, whom I had not heard from since the funeral lunch. I let every call go to voicemail. There are moments when answering too quickly gives other people the chance to decide the shape of your story before you have even understood it yourself. I made tea instead. I sat at the kitchen table with my red notebook, the folded mailbox label, the locksmith receipt, and Henry's envelope arranged in front of me like quiet witnesses. The first voicemail was Brian's. His voice was tight, embarrassed, and tired. "Mom, Madison is very upset. She says you locked her out in front of people. Please call me before this gets worse." I played it twice, not because I needed to hear his words again, but because I wanted to notice what was missing. He did not ask whether I was all right. He did not ask why his wife had arrived with fabric samples and strangers after I had refused to sign her papers the night before. He only worried that Madison had been embarrassed. The second message was from Carol, soft and uncertain. Eleanor, honey, Madison says you have been acting confused and making sudden decisions. She is worried you should not be alone right now. I looked around my kitchen at the bills stacked neatly by due date, the pill organizer filled for the week, the calendar marked with my dentist appointment, the fresh groceries I had bought with my own debit card. Confused. That word had become Madison's new key. And when the real one stopped working, she tried to use that instead. By evening, the story had spread. Madison told people I was grieving so badly that I had become paranoid. She said I was imagining things, misplacing items, accusing her of stealing memories, refusing help, and now shutting family out of the house. She sounded concerned enough to be believed by people who did not look too closely. That was Madison's gift. She could wrap a demand in sympathy until it looked like care. At 7:30, Brian finally sent a text instead of calling. Mom, please do not embarrass us. We are trying to help. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I typed slowly, using every word in full because I wanted no confusion. No opening for him to pretend he misunderstood. I already survived the embarrassment. Now I am dealing with the facts. He did not answer for 12 minutes. When he did, all he wrote was, "That does not sound like you." I almost smiled. No, it did not sound like the woman who covered his mistakes, excused his silence, and pretended not to hear the disrespect gathering in corners of rooms. It sounded like someone new. Or maybe someone old who had finally returned. The next morning, Madison changed tactics. A woman from Willow Creek called to confirm whether I still wanted to move forward with my application. I told her I had never submitted one. There was a pause, then the rustle of papers. Your daughter-in-law indicated you had given verbal approval. I did not, I said. My voice was calm enough that the woman became embarrassed for both of us. I asked her to email me a copy of anything with my name on it. After that, I called Charles Bennett and told him everything. He did not sound surprised. This is the part where they try to make your refusal look like incapacity, he said. We expected this. I wrote that sentence down. We expected this. It steadied me. Charles told me to request my medical records, save every message, and avoid private conversations that could be twisted later. By noon, I had a printed wellness summary from Dr. Patel's office stating that I lived independently, managed my own medications, drove safely, and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. The receptionist handed it to me with a kind smile and said, "You take care, Mrs. Whitaker." Mrs. Whitaker. My name still intact. When I returned home, Madison's white SUV was parked across the street. She sat inside with her phone pressed to her ear watching my driveway. I carried my papers into the house without looking at her. 10 minutes later, Brian texted again. Madison thinks we may need to discuss power of attorney. I placed the phone on the table, opened Henry's envelope, and touched the edge of his note. Then I wrote one reply. Any discussion about my legal rights will happen with my attorney present. This time Brian answered quickly. Why are you making this so formal? I looked toward the front door, at the new lock shining beneath the hall light. Because informal was how they had tried to take everything. I decided to invite them before they could invite themselves. By Thursday afternoon, Madison had already convinced half the family that I was becoming difficult, so I gave her exactly what she wanted. A family meeting in my living room. I called Brian first and told him to come Sunday at 3 o'clock. Then I called Carol, Henry's cousin Paul, and my neighbor Mrs. Donnelly, who had known us since Brian was in elementary school and had watched Madison bring strangers to my porch with fabric samples. Last I called Charles Bennett. Are you sure you want everyone there? He asked. I looked at the new lock on the front door, the one that had turned Madison's certainty into surprise. Yes, I said. For once, I want witnesses before the story gets rewritten. On Sunday, I prepared coffee, lemon cookies, and a folder for each person. I wore my navy dress, the one Henry always said made me look steady. Not pretty, not young, not delicate. Steady. At 2:55, Madison arrived with Brian. She stepped onto the porch as if entering a courtroom where she had already won. Her hair was smooth, her camel coat expensive, her smile soft enough to fool anyone who had not heard her whisper when she thought I was upstairs. Brian stood beside her, pale and quiet. I opened the door myself. Madison's eyes flicked to the lock, then to my face. I am glad you are being reasonable, she said. I moved aside. Come in. The living room had never felt so alert. Henry's photograph was back on the mantel. His flag was back in its case. My china was back in the dining room hutch, each plate washed and placed where it belonged. Madison noticed. Her smile tightened. Carol sat on the sofa, twisting a tissue in her hand. Paul stood near the window. Mrs. Donnelly sat upright in Henry's old recliner after asking my permission twice. Charles was already seated at the small desk by the bookcase, his leather briefcase open beside him. When Madison saw him, the color moved out of her face in a slow, careful way. "Why is there an attorney here?" she asked. "Because you suggested power of attorney," I said. "I thought we should discuss legal matters properly." Brian looked at Madison. Madison looked at the floor, then recovered. "This is exactly what concerns us, Eleanor. You are turning family care into something hostile." Charles stood before I could answer. His voice was calm, practiced, and impossible to push aside. "Mrs. Whitaker has asked me to clarify several facts. First, this property is solely and legally owned by Eleanor Whitaker. The deed was transferred and recorded 3 years ago by Henry Whitaker, with full legal capacity and proper documentation." He placed a certified copy on the coffee table. Madison stared at it as if the paper had spoken out of turn. Brian leaned forward, his mouth slightly open. "Dad did that." Charles nodded. "He did. He also updated estate provisions regarding coercion, financial pressure, and attempts to remove Mrs. Whitaker from her residence for personal gain." The room went very still. I watched Brian absorb every word, not as a son, but as a man realizing silence had cost him more than comfort. Madison gave a small laugh. "This is being exaggerated. We were only trying to help her transition." I opened my folder and placed the unsigned consent form on top of the deed. Then the Willow Creek email. Then the photograph of the mailbox label. Then the locksmith receipt. Then my doctor's summary. Finally, I opened the doorbell camera app on my phone and played the recording from the day Madison arrived with the decorator. Her own voice filled the room clear and bright. "Once the old woman is out, we will open up this wall." No one moved. The silence after those words was sharper than any shouting could have been. Carol covered her mouth. Paul looked away. Brian closed his eyes. Madison reached for her purse strap, but for once she had no polished sentence ready. I looked at her, not with anger, not even with triumph. Only recognition. "You were not helping me leave," I said. "You were helping yourself arrive." Madison's lips parted, then closed again. Charles gathered the papers with quiet precision. "For the record," he said, "any further attempt to pressure Mrs. Whitaker regarding her home, finances, or legal authority should go through my office." Brian whispered. "Mom." I turned to him slowly. "Not yet," I said. "You had many chances to speak when it would have mattered." He lowered his eyes, and this time I let him. Madison left before the coffee cooled. She did not storm out, because storming would have made her look guilty. She gathered her purse, smoothed the front of her coat, and gave the room one last injured look, the kind meant to ask everyone to notice how unfairly she had been treated. No one followed her. That was the first honest thing that had happened in my living room all week. Brian stayed by the window after the others began leaving, staring at the dogwood tree as if it might explain his father to him. Carol hugged me carefully and whispered that she was sorry she had believed Madison so quickly. Paul shook Charles Bennett's hand and said Henry had always been a smarter man than people realized. Mrs. Donnelly pressed the empty cookie plate into my hands and told me she would be across the street if I needed anything at all. One by one, the witnesses left, and the house settled back into itself. Not empty this time, just quiet. Charles was the last to go. At the door, he handed me a second folder with certified copies of everything. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said. "And Eleanor, do not let anyone make you feel cruel for protecting what is yours." I thanked him, and for the first time since Henry's funeral, my voice did not break when I said my husband's name. After Charles drove away, Brian was still standing in the living room. He looked smaller than he had that morning, not because he had changed, but because the excuses around him had finally fallen off. "Mom," he said, "I did not know Dad changed the deed." I placed the folder on the desk. "That is not what hurt me most." He swallowed. "I know. But I could see that he did not know, not all the way. Not yet. So I told him. I told him it was not only the house. It was the way he let Madison take down his father's picture while I was still visiting the cemetery. It was the way he brought a brochure instead of bringing comfort. It was the way he watched another person rename my grief as confusion because it made his life easier. Brian sat down in Henry's chair, then seemed to realize where he was and stood again quickly. "I am sorry," he said. The words were small, but they were the first ones he had offered without Madison placing them in his mouth. I wanted to gather him up the way I did when he was a boy. I wanted to forgive him before he had earned it, because mothers are trained by love to reach for their children even when their children have walked away. Instead, I folded my hands. A son who watches his mother be erased has to earn his way back. His eyes filled, but he nodded. "Can I come by tomorrow?" I looked toward the front door, at the new lock shining beneath the hall light. "You may call tomorrow," I said. "Then I will decide." It was not punishment. It was a boundary, and I was old enough to know the difference. Brian left through the front door, not the garage, because he no longer had the code. I watched him walk down the porch steps and sit in his car for several minutes before driving away. When the taillights disappeared, I turned off every lamp except the one beside Henry's photograph. Then I went to the kitchen and made coffee in the dented percolator, even though it was too late in the evening for caffeine and Henry would have teased me for it. I poured it into his blue-chipped mug, sat at the small table facing his empty chair, and let the steam rise between us like one more quiet conversation. The house was still old. The floor near the pantry still creaked. The furnace still clicked before it warmed the rooms. The dogwood branches still scratched softly at the window when the wind moved across Maple Grove Road. Nothing looked dramatically different except the locks. Yet everything had changed. Madison had wanted me out because she believed age made me easy to move. Brian had stayed silent because silence was cheaper than courage. But Henry had left me more than a deed. He had left me proof that my life was not something others could pack, label, and carry away. The next morning, sunlight touched the brass deadbolt and made it shine. I stood in the hallway with my coffee, looking at the door that had finally learned to protect me. That day, I did not just change who could enter my house. I changed who was allowed to make me feel small.